it's gonna be them. Like,
Yeah.
All right. Let's get started. So our computer randomizer has selected the presentation order for next week. So it'll look something like this. You can swap if you want, but you have to let me know. And importantly, for everybody, the presentations are due at the start of class on Monday. So make sure to get that in before you come. And that applies to both if you're presenting on Wednesday and Monday, so that everyone has same amount of time to work on it. Any questions about the presentations next week? Yes.
Do you want them in TPX, TPX, or TPX? Assuming you're probably going to.
I don't care. Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to smush them all together.
No. People will get up here and plug in their computers, and yeah. The what?
The duration for presentation.
Oh, so we've got 5 to 6, 2 hours. So I'm gonna say 12 to 15 minutes. So then we have time for questions. We'll make it a little bit longer. I'm like such a stickler for my syllabus, so. Yeah, we'll say 10 to 15 minutes. How about that?
Sure, yeah. Just give me that lower balance.
0 to 15 minutes.
That would be,
Well, with the constraint being, I still want to get the potential.
that would be bold.
In the time save.
I was trying to optimize this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You guys.
That's our project. We're switching.
Okay, so last class of the quarter. We're going to be talking about federal policies. So we've actually covered a bunch of stuff out of California, which I think was really relevant, especially for, pertinent for modeling discussion. But this happens at the federal level too, and in other countries and internationally. But we're going to look at a couple of US policies today. So we're actually gonna cover both piece of legislation and actually a piece of regulation as well. And I think we've kind of touched on this here and there, but to formalize it, right? When we think about a law, this can be a law can be created through 2 different avenues. So one is known as legislation, and one is known as regulation, right? And so legislation is created by your legislature, which are essentially your elected officials, right? And so any individual senator or congressman or woman, congressperson, or at the state level, it's kind of analogous. A state representative can introduce a law. And essentially, the actual process of going from that initial bill to an actual law, it goes through a series of steps, right? So that law will then get relegated to the committee that kind of makes the most sense, or set of committees that make the most sense to look at that particular piece of legislation, and then it has to pass through both the House and the Senate, right, depending on who created it. And then once it passes both sides, and I should also mention throughout this process, right, it can be altered and modified. It gets finalized when the president, or at the state level, the governor signs it, and then that bill is considered signed into law. So I think most people typically think of this avenue when we think about laws, but regulations are also laws, and this goes through a fairly different sort of process, right? So regulation is essentially put forth by a regulatory agency, and so this one I believe we talked a little bit more about, right? So when a regulatory agency puts out a rule, they first propose a rulemaking, it then gets open to the public for commenting, then that comes back to the regulatory agency, they have to address all the comments, then it gets, then they put out a final rule. And that has the same force of law that legislation has. Okay, so why would we have these unelected regulators making laws for us citizens? Why is there a separate sort of pathway to create laws? Yeah.
The agencies are set up through legislation.
That's actually not entirely true. So regulatory agencies actually fall under the executive branch, not the legislative branch. So it's so even to that extent, they are not necessarily even chosen by representatives, strictly speaking. So to dive into a little bit of detail, so a regulatory agency would be comprised of two types of employees. You have like career people, career staff, and then you have political appointees. And political appointees are actually selected by the executive branch, although they do need to, some subset of them need to be approved by Congress. So there is some input there, but we primarily think of regulatory agencies as a executive, part of the executive branch. Yeah. The question was, why do we have regulatory agencies that make laws?
Oh, because you need the continuity for people that specialize knowledge. They're not necessarily either Democrat or Republican. They just kind of do what's best in most of the time in the mind of the regulatory agencies for air or water, or whatever else.
Exactly. Yeah. So regulatory agencies have a body of knowledge and expertise in subject matters that legislators just wouldn't have, right? So like for the FCC, I wouldn't expect my elected official to be like, ah, yes, Wi-Fi has to be in this like band of of frequency, wavelength, right? Like they wouldn't know anything about that. And so having regulatory agencies is a nice way of handling sort of more complex subjects that require specialized knowledge in and require nuance in that sort of body of law. Yeah.
So to sort of expedite the process, especially with changes being made or minor changes that are already based on legislation or law, so maybe clearing up ambiguities, and you don't want any clarifications to go through the whole legislative process again. So is it to expedite?
No, definitely not. Regulation takes just as long, if not substantially longer, than legislation. So, this process going through committees, getting passed between the House and Senate, depending on the like political nature of the bill, can take a while, certainly, and it can stall out and all of that, and that is kind of expected of the sort of political process. But you could get a bill through like a very sort of bipartisan bill, everyone's on board, you could get that through very quickly. You can't, well, I will talk about some exceptions today, but right, to draft a rule, to go through the open comment period, to respond to the comments, and then to draft the final rule, like minimum 9 months. And that would be a pretty like fast turnaround. Okay. So one of the policies we're going to talk about today, near and dear to my heart, corporate average fuel economy standards. This is what I spent most of grad school working on. So fairly familiar with this topic and sort of the nuances behind this regulation. So historically, let's cover a little bit of historical context. The oil crisis in the 1970s led to this piece of legislation being passed, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975. And that was right in response to that oil crisis that basically mandated that we increase energy production and supply, reduce energy demand, provide energy efficiency, and then have like more discretionary powers essentially to respond to disruptions in the energy supply. And actually, so one thing that I should mention, going back to the legislation versus regulation piece of things, so the legislature can actually pass laws to say, hey, regulators, I want you to regulate something, right? And so they may identify a public need for some type of regulation, but they wouldn't form the nuances of the regulation themselves. They would essentially mandate that a regulatory agency address a particular topic. And so that's exactly what happened here. They required the US DOT, specifically the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is one of the arms of the US DOT, to enforce compliance with efficiency standards, right? And so one of the ways we deal with this oil crisis issue is to reduce energy demand and provide energy efficiency, right? So which would reduce your overall consumption of oil by making cars more efficient. So the history of the corporate average fuel economy standards has led to this sort of trend that we observe here in fuel efficiency. So this is kind of the average observed. These aren't actually the standard requirements themselves, but this is the observed change in fuel efficiency of vehicles over time. So you have domestic and imported cars, you have light trucks, and your sort of total fleet. One thing to note from like the 1990s up to around 2010, actually the fuel economy standards were actually fairly flat. They remain sort of unchanged for both passenger cars and trucks. And so that's actually where you can see this sort of trend in decrease in fuel efficiency as automakers were trying to favor other attributes of vehicles, like increasing the power, getting your 0 to 60 up, and increasing the weight of vehicles. But then once the economy standards came back in, sort of, you can see the stringency increase again. Okay. So, CAFE. So this is one of the most common misconceptions. So it is a requirement for automakers, not for individual cars. So you may have heard in the last decade, okay, CAFE standards require cars to be at 55 mpg by 2025, right? That does not mean that all cars have to be 55 miles per gallon. It means that, the sales weighted target for a manufacturer needs to hit that average, but individual cars don't need to comply with CAFE. Okay, so pretty straightforward. If you have a manufacturer that sells 10, 20 mpg cars and 10, 30 mpg cars, what would the average fuel economy for that manufacturer be? No, you're all wrong. So this is actually a trick question. So the US and is it Australia, I think, are the only two countries that report fuel efficiencies in MPG. The rest of the world does it in inverse, gallons per mile or liters per kilometer or liters per 100 kilometers. And the reason for that is there's a sort of non-linearity between MPGs. So really, the way to calculate this would be 10 over 20 MPG, so 10 cars. To do the average, you have to do the harmonic average. So 10 cars over 30 MPG equals 20 cars over X. And if you solve for X, this will be slightly less than 25. Has anyone heard of the MPG illusion? Yeah, a couple people. Yeah, so that's the idea, right? So if you look at fuel consumption as a function of MPG, it's a non-linear. And so it's actually fairly unintuitive how to do calculations with MPGs. Yeah.
That's because you're less efficient, go faster. There's like a sweet spot speed that you get to optimal MPGs.
No, it's just a 1 over X instead of X. So okay, so have I done this example for you guys? Let me see. Okay, so if I have car 1 and car 2, oops. Car 1 and car 2. So car 1 goes 20 mpg and car 2 goes 40 mpg. And then I decide I want to switch car 1 or car 2. So car 1 gets plus 5 mpg and car 2 gets plus 10 mpg. So this would get 25 mpg and this goes up to 50 mpg. Okay, so which of these switches would save more gasoline? A 5 mile per gallon increase or a 10 mile per gallon increase? 5? Why 5? That's half the. Yeah, so okay, so if I travel 100 miles in car 1, then it would be 5 gallons. If I traveled 100 miles in the updated version, it would be 4 miles. So I would save 1 gallon of gas. If I went 100 miles in a 40 mpg car, it would be 2.5 gallons. And then if I went 100 miles in a 50 mpg car, it would be 2 gallons. So I would actually save 0.5 gallons. Yeah. So what does this mean? This means if I switching from like a Honda Civic to a Toyota Prius is actually not as good as getting someone out of a Hummer into like a Ford F-150, right? The relative amount of emission savings at low MPGs and making an improvement is in a very non-linear way much better than getting someone from a good car to a really good car in terms of efficiency. So something to think about and relevant to kind of this discussion, right? As we think about the like cars versus trucks discussion, in my mind, the efficiency and emissions requirements for trucks is substantially more important than the one for cars. And all of this confusion, and actually people have looked at this too, like asking people who are buying cars to do some of these calculations about like how much money they're going to save and how much gas they're going to use. And like even people like even people who are very familiar with the field get these questions wrong all the time. And that's entirely a product of the fact that we use MPG instead of gallons per mile. Yeah.
Is there role for regulators in trying to make these numbers make more sense? I mean, is there legislation when you put out that car makers need to advertise in gallons per mile rather than miles per gallon?
No. No, yeah, it's too late for that. But what I will say, they do try and make it easier. So in Moroni stickers, for example, which is a legislative, or is that a regulatory? No, it is a legislative requirement. So Moroni stickers, which are those pieces of paper that are plastered on the side of the car when you go to a car dealership, those are required to have certain content of information, including things like the like gasoline savings in like dollars, or like the gasoline consumption, so that people don't have to like try and figure it out themselves. Yeah.
Is Europe through its power efficiency standards in grams CO2?
No.
Would it be better to look in terms of carbon impacts to these things?
Well, okay, wait. They have EU. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
I only said no because it's not a fuel efficiency standard; it's an emission standard. But they are the same thing, effectively. And in fact, let me.
Grams CO2 per kilometer then?
Yes. Yes. Okay, hang on. So efficiency in any country not called the United States, and I would feel bad if I got it wrong, but I'm pretty sure Australia does MPG. Oh, it is? Okay, there's one other country. Sorry, Australia, it's not you if you're listening on YouTube. There's another country that does MPG. I can't remember which one it is.
United States, UK, and Canada.
Wait, UK?
That's what this says.
Oh. I don't think. Yeah. Anyways, so back to my train of thought. Efficiency is reported typically as liters per 100 kilometers or liters per kilometer, depends on country. And then as far as regulation goes, the EU does have a set of emission standards, which is grams of CO2 per kilometer.
So which would be better as a policy option if the target is carbon?
It's not better or worse, right? So they're exactly the same. They're like there's a direct relationship between CO2 and MPG. So let me show you guys.
If you're regulating car makers, but it makes more sense to do.
Well, we're gonna get into this whole debate. Don't worry. We're gonna get there. So actually, I cut out.
Improperly, change the whole meaning of the sentence.
So this is my last year's lecture. I actually cut this out because it's a figure that I made a long time ago that's not that's out of date. But okay, so this, yeah, because I made this in grad school, which was like a decade ago. So you can see here, on this axis, it's grams of CO2 per mile, and on this axis is MPG, and there's a direct relationship between these two, right? So I usually say never have secondary axes unless there's a actual relationship. So in this case, it actually makes sense. And what you can see, here's this nonlinear part, right? the amount of emissions savings from 15 to 20 is like the same as 20 to 30, which is the same as like 30 up to like 60, right? So that's why it looks like this is an inverse relationship.
This is what EVs,
Well, EVs don't have an MPG.
right, but in terms of like, you could say, you know, kilowatt.
Well, okay, we're gonna get to that. We're gonna get to that.
Is it also, is it non-linear as well?
So EVs can be reported as kilowatt hours per mile, which would be the same as your energy piece over your
Yeah.
consumption piece, or it can be miles per kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
So I would love it if we took this opportunity to do kilowatt hours per mile, but it seems like we're reverting to miles per kilowatt hour for most things in the regulation. So
Yeah.
we're staying with the MPG instead of GPM. Unfortunately, we had a chance, but yeah.
Actually, it seemed that for electric vehicles, they are something like miles per gallon, and doesn't include it,
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Yeah.
but is it linear?
Well, it's the exact same thing.
Exactly.
It's exactly the same.
It's just saying.
Yeah. Okay, so we will get to alt fuels in a bit. That was like the entire topic of my graduate study. So let me talk a little bit about how it works first. So when you comply with the regulation, you generate credits based on your target, and then you can trade them between automakers. They can also be banked. And then NHTSA can actually enforce civil penalties. So you get a penalty every year of $50, $55 per one MPG out of compliance per vehicle. In other words, if I am an automaker and I sell 1,000 cars and I am one MPG under on average, then I would be I would have a civil penalty of about $55,000, right? So 55 times the number of cars that I sold. So historically, prior to sort of the latest version of CAFE, American manufacturers are generally sort of right in compliance, year on year. A lot of Asian manufacturers are over compliance, which means they are more fuel efficient than is required, and so they generate lots of credits. And then a lot of European manufacturers are under compliant, meaning that they end up having to pay fines and penalties. And part of the willingness to do that has to do with the fact that a lot of these European manufacturers are sort of more luxury brands, and so it's basically a cost of business for them, where they're willing to take that penalty in order to be able to, have like high power vehicles and that sort of thing. Yeah.
How to make the penalty actually use.
Okay, we're gonna get there. Yeah. It's gonna change in a second. Because you notice this is up to 2008. Yeah.
Kind of a nice side effect of commitment to MPG, because as the regulations get stricter, it's more important to be closer to compliance.
No, it would do the opposite, because you would want larger penalties at like lower, you would want nonlinear penalties essentially in order to make it so that the type of benefit that you're getting reflects the amount of penalty at different levels of MPG.
So this would mean that you get fined more for being 30 versus 33 MPG compared to 15 versus 18, right? Or sorry, it'd be the same, you'd be charged the same, but
Yes.
the gap between 15 and 18 is much more emissions than the gap between
Yeah, so when your standard is lower, you would want the penalty to be higher, essentially. But that's not how it works. So
Is there any discrepancy in these standards in the US and Europe? Because why do European car makers?
yeah, European car makers are not subject, or sorry. The standards are kind of the same for everyone. I have to say that because it's going to get weird in a second. But yeah, they're not subject to different standards than.
No, in terms of, if they're selling a car in Europe and they.
No. Cars in Europe have nothing to do with anything here at all. No, why US cannot enforce any requirements on cars in Europe. There is some sort of international effect in the sense that like it may be cheaper for you to if you have similar or identical platforms in multiple countries to just make them all comply with everything, and that kind of does happen a little bit, but generally speaking, a lot of manufacturers have just different platforms in different regions.
There's no alignment in the US, EU.
No, definitely not. Yes.
You're trying to get alignment in the test cycle.
Yeah.
Measure, but it's not happening yet.
Yeah. The test cycles, which are the things that determine the MPG rating of a vehicle, there's a 2-cycle, 5-cycle in the US, and then in Europe and worldwide, they used to have. Oh, I always get the order wrong. WLTP, and then what's the other one? And NEDC, that's the one. Yeah. So NEDC is the old one. WLTP is the new one. They're not even close to each other. They all are kind of terrible, to be honest. I would say the 5-cycle test that the EPA uses is usually going to be closest to like real world fuel efficiencies. At the end of the day, though, it doesn't need to be 100% accurate, right? It is a standardized basis on which to compare different vehicles, and to that end, it does perfectly fine unless your name is Volkswagen and you decide to cheat.
Is that them on the bottom, the 40 million?
No. This is pre-Dieselgate. Yeah.
So no, I'm just thinking if that was
This
yeah, like the irony of it, like oh, super.
I don't know why
Millions of dollars.
that doesn't show up. No, but like these are all like these guys are like luxury brands, right? Daimler, Porsche, BMW. Okay. So let me head back into here. Okay. So this thing that I mentioned is going to lead to some interesting politics situation that the CAFE standards were frozen for something like 20 years. So starting in the 1990s. So California, since we are, way more aggressive about our regulations, Senator Fran Pavley decided to author AB 1493, which is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from vehicle tailpipes, which is effectively fuel economy standard. Okay, so any problems with California trying to do this? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So if you guys think back to our earlier lecture on ZEV, the only reason they are even allowed to do this is because of that preemption that gave California the ability to preempt anything related to the Clean Air Act, right? California had its own Clean Air Act prior to federal one. Federal said California can have their own, but any changes requires a waiver from the EPA. And so initially when this happened, that was made in 2005, and for a long period of time, it was kind of just ignored. And then eventually was denied by the US EPA in March 2008. So who was president at this time? Bush, right? So what ends up happening is that during the Bush administration, they basically turned this down and prevented California from being able to do this. All right, at the same time that this is all happening, we have Massachusetts and 11 other states in 2007 decided to sue the EPA in order to determine whether the EPA has the legal authority to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act. So this is a pretty landmark Supreme Court case. So if you think about Clean Air Act as pertaining to the regulation of pollutants, right? CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And so whether or not that qualifies as a pollutant was something that they had to figure out. And so eventually the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA not only had the legal authority to, but actually are required to regulate CO2 emissions. And so specifically this case was regarding from mobile sources. So basically forced EPA to regulate CO2 emissions. Yeah.
The recent case in the last like Supreme Court docket was state sources like fence line, right?
Yeah, but it's a more narrow sort of ruling. That's yeah.
That they couldn't do anything beyond the fence line of like a plan or something.
It's a little more complicated than that. Yeah. Okay. So all this stuff is happening at the same time. So then Obama comes in and he says, EPA gets waivers, right? And so now we have this new situation happening where you have the US DOT regulating fuel efficiency. You have US EPA regulating grams of CO2 per mile. And then you have California doing their own set of emission standards. And all of them can be totally separate, disparate sets of standards, which means car companies would have to comply with many different requirements. Yeah.
If the MPG and the ground CO2 are one-for-one correlated, then why would you deciding to do standards to different agencies?
Well, that's just how it turned out, right? So these guys are required to regulate fuel efficiency, and these guys are required to regulate CO2. So they're both required. So they're required by the judicial system. They're required by the legislative system to make these regulations.
But how is it to be independent if one setting fuel efficiency standard doesn't affect on the ground CO2 standards?
Okay, so let's say these guys make a standard and these guys make a standard. As a car company, you would have to follow whichever one is more strict. And if you're following the one that's more strict, then you've automatically followed the other one, right?
Executive branch agencies have like very like specific authorities that they can't like overlap.
Okay, so automakers hated this. And sort of very rightfully so, it would be very difficult and costly to follow 3 different standards. So EPA and NHTSA basically agreed to harmonize their standards so that they basically match for the most part. So greenhouse gas emission standards are going to regulate grams of CO2 per mile. CAFE standards are going to regulate miles per gallon, but effectively the lines are going to be the same. Okay. And as part of this whole thing, California says, all right, we will choose not to make a separate standard, but having California at the table was really important at the time because they were basically able to say, we're only going to do that if you guys make sure that the targets are pretty stringent. Okay, so having California at the table was able to influence the policy a lot. Yeah.
The miles per gallon, grams of CO2 per mile, like those are converted the same, but like the inputs to get to that number. So like, is the EPA, that could be like the mix of like the gasoline, right? Like maybe there's like a certain mix, like how clean the gas is, or like other components that go into like intensity of it, whereas miles per gallon is more like your engine has to be good, right?
No, it's on average. So there's one number that converts a gallon to grams of CO2. And it changes ever so slightly. 10 years ago, it was 8,887 grams of CO2 per gallon. It's now like 8,900, but basically the same. And that's not really going to change.
Right, but it doesn't give them, by saying they have authority to regulate grams of CO2 per mile, that does not also give them authority to say, okay, oil and gas, you need to improve your.
No, this is remember, this is a regulation on automakers, not on fuel producers. Yeah, and that's going to be relevant when we think about EVs. Yeah.
But actually, measure the grams of CO2 the standard.
Yeah. Yes.
CO2 emissions and then with that.
Well, they also measure the amount of fuel they put in. Yeah. But yes, that's right.
The states that choose to California's without California standards, they have their own regulatory agencies like CARB that have their own regulations saying that, oh, we need to follow California standards.
No. Wait, what? CARB is the one that sets the standard.
And the states that choose to follow it.
You're talking about section.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, 177 states. Yeah, they follow whatever CARB says.
But they don't have their own CARB-like regulatory agencies.
No.
California's are, they have like Department of Natural Resources or things like that, but they don't have the ability.
Okay.
CARB, how big is CARB? Does anyone know? Like employees. It's got to be at least, yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say upper, like close to 1,000 up to, yeah, 1,000 to 2,000. Yeah.
1,700.
1,700. Okay, so CARB has 1,700 employees. Even like a state like New York, like their equivalent of CARB is like a dozen people, right? So CARB is fairly unique amongst sort of regulatory agencies at the state level. Okay. So all of this was happening at the beginning of the first Obama administration. They set out this rulemaking, jointly between the DOT and EPA in order to harmonize those targets. So they had this declaration for 54.5 mpg by 2025 on the 2-cycle test, which really is like 37, 38 mpg in reality, but still, pretty stringent. So from a regulatory perspective, NHTSA isn't allowed to regulate for 14 years. So the regulation was split into two phases, 2012 to 2016, 2017 to 2025. Also, because, yeah, I don't think I have this on the slide, so I did want to revisit, I think, your question earlier about the penalties. So the type of penalties that we were talking about, the $55 per MPG, that's a civil compliance penalty. EPA, they get to do criminal compliance penalties. And so that was one of the big things when this was first coming about. So EPA was doing I think a $5,000 per car per day that you were out of compliance. So it was effectively like 1,000,000 times higher. So you really can't get out of compliance if you're a car company. You would like rapidly go bankrupt. Yeah.
But isn't that it there? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. But I think what we've seen is like people very rapidly went to compliance. So we didn't really have to worry about it that much. Yeah. There's also like there was also discussion of possible like criminal charges that like could land like if you were purposefully being negligent, well, like executives could actually go to jail, right? So
Did anybody jail in New
no fines, big fines, yeah, big-ish fines, not actually that big, but okay, they changed to a footprint-based standard. Okay, so footprint is describing kind of like the size of a vehicle. It is basically the area between the wheels. And so the way this works is, okay, the reason why they do this is because they didn't want to unduly and uniformly penalize car makers who are producing big cars versus small cars. So you could argue about whether that's proper in terms of like really thinking about efficiency and emissions, but we'll kind of leave it at that, right? So the idea here, so every year refers to the or every line refers to the standard in a particular year. And basically the way that you read this is, so small car, big car, okay? And so MPG, it's opposite, right? MPG is going from low to high, emissions are going from low to high this way. So really, as you go down, the more fuel efficient and the cleaner your car is. So big cars on the line get to emit more, and then smaller cars have to emit less, okay? And then as time goes on, that standard ratchets downwards. And so, you know, if you're here, yes, you get to make 25 MPG trucks, but then every year it has to get cleaner and cleaner. So from here down to here, you're going from like 400 grams per mile down to like 250 grams per mile. Yeah.
What's the distribution of the footprint vehicles?
Oh, yeah. I don't know what it is anymore, but like back then, trucks were like here, sort of on the upper end near the kink, and then passenger cars are kind of like in the middle.
But now trucks are probably 30 to the right, bigger and bigger, right? Instead of 25.
Wait for it.
Oh.
One last thing that I'll say, what the hell is happening over here? So this was like concessions from the regulators to some of the manufacturers producing lots of trucks. They made it easier to comply. You see like weird stuff happening with the lines over here. Probably, yeah. Okay. So when this initially came out, you know, there was some interesting modeling and stuff happening. And so there was this author, Katie Whitefoot, she made this equilibrium model to estimate or sort of predict how automakers would respond to these regulations. And one of the findings was that they would have a strong incentive essentially to increase their vehicle size, right? So instead of trying to comply with fuel efficiency, you could essentially increase the footprint of your vehicle. And to be fair, I shouldn't even say necessarily increasing your vehicle size. It does actually do that. And we do observe that, but also you can move your wheels like closer to the ends and you can make them slightly wider. And that would be a way to essentially comply with CAFE, even if that's not necessarily the intent of the regulation. And so this is a nice sort of modeling paper that was kind of introducing this concept. And actually what we found in reality is that that's exactly what happened. So yeah.
Is that like, because there's pictures I've seen of Ford Ranger from the mid-2000s, and it's like nicely sized, like it's smaller than you see like the equivalent vehicle that it's like a house. And like, is that
a lot of that, yeah, has to do with this. Yeah. Yeah, it creates a strong incentive to do that. Yeah.
Quite different in what Europe pays because the regulations that Europe are based on the mass of the vehicle.
Yes.
So it was also an incentive to make
heavier vehicles, exactly.
More, which is easier than making the
yeah. Yeah, so actually I do know that at the time that people were thinking about this, right, there was a lot of modeling and studying going into trying to differentiate and make the standards kind of like quote unquote fairer for different automakers. So they were looking at things like weight, like footprint, and you can look at these like regression models that people were coming up with. But that was, again, the intent of that was to kind of make it so that you wouldn't be overly burdening certain automakers. And that is important for like a political reasons to make sure your regulation gets passed. But people probably didn't quite realize that meant that there was like another lever that you could use to comply with the regulation. Yeah.
If you were to go back and do this again, would you still do it at footprint or do it by mass, or is it you would think was best?
Me, I don't know. I would probably keep it flat, like, and just have some automakers suck it up and deal with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I would do.
The real goal is to essentially cap, or not cap emissions, but to.
Yeah, but you know, there's like political realities to these things. So yeah.
Was wondering how
Oh, they threw a big stink about all sorts of things, and like Toyota, for example, hated this, right? Because they were like, "Oh, you guys are giving GM and Ford like all this like extra benefit by making it easier to do truck compliance," right? So you know, everyone was complaining about different things at that time. Yeah. Huh?
That's the most difficult part.
Yeah, the political part of it, for sure. Yeah.
Are there any like extra like unintended consequences of spreading the accidents. It's actually marginally better in terms of like road damage, right?
Yes, no, it is. It is. Actually, a lot of there are positive consequences of doing that, like what you're mentioning. Well, I guess negative ones are the ones I'm talking about, where they're making, where in addition to increasing the footprint, it also incentivizes them to make the cars themselves bigger. So that was a negative consequence. But yeah, increasing the footprint itself, aside from kind of like gaming the system, is actually can be a good thing. Yeah. It helps with safety too, as I understand. So there are some positive outcomes. Okay. So how do the regulatory agencies actually sort of decide on like 55 mpg or whatever numbers associated with those lines? Because you could make it super strict and then no one would really be able to comply. So EPA had Omega and NHTSA had Volpe. These were essentially models that were used in order to figure out effective pathways and like cost efficient ways under like budget constraints in order to get to a particular like fuel efficiency outcome. So they first talked to a bunch of people in automakers and in the industry, and they actually had this optimization model that iterates with market information and a vehicle choice model in order to kind of like figure out, for the portfolio of cars that Ford sells, like how could they start implementing fuel efficiency technologies to get to specific targets? How much would that cost them? And so how can we make targets that would be difficult but feasible, right? So that's actually all this one big sort of modeling exercise. Yeah. Volpe. Yeah.
They're separate models.
No, they're not combined. They are respectively the different agencies, models to look at this. Later on, the national academies convened a bunch of experts to kind of update that, looking at costs of different technologies to improve fuel efficiency. So like these are spark ignition technologies, lubricants, engine friction reduction, all the way up to hybridization, mass reduction. So then, there are these giant spreadsheets of like costs and technologies that you can implement into cars in order to improve them. Yeah.
What is RP average with 1.5 RP? The fourth column from after abbreviation.
Oh,
To the right.
RPE is a scenario that they were looking at. Yeah. Okay, so actually one of the things that I had studied was thinking about how CAFE would interact with other policies. No, I should say ADZEV mandate. So the idea is when these regulatory agencies are like, okay, I'm going to improve fuel efficiency for these vehicles, you're first going to do these, low rolling resistance tires, adding lubrication in this like order, right? Because they want to do it most cost effectively. That gets you to some kind of target, right? And the cost of compliance with the policy based off of that will give you some kind of number. So we can actually replicate their models and update them with National Academies costs from those updates, but then we can also include other policies like ZEV, for example. So what ZEV does is it says, instead of you, automaker, taking the most cost-effective pathway to improve your fuel efficiency, you actually have to jump to the end of that cost compliant or that cost effectiveness curve, because electrification, improving fuel efficiency, at least back then, is probably the least cost-effective thing that you could do. So that changes the cost of automakers' compliance to meet the targets, right? And so that's what this paper was doing. Yeah.
How does CAFE consider EVs?
Okay, we're almost there, I promise. Okay. So yeah, let's think about that. So fuel economy and emission rates are no longer tied together for electric vehicles, right? Because now there's an efficiency associated with like the battery and the motors, right? And so there's some energy that gets translated into distance. But then for emissions, it's not just burning a set amount of gas. Like it could be coming from a gas plant, a coal plant. It could be the electricity could be coming from solar or wind. And so fundamentally, your fuel economy and emission rates are no longer tied together. So for alternative fuel vehicles, this coupling that happened between CAFE and EPA kind of doesn't really make that much sense anymore, right? And so to demonstrate that, for this Toyota Prius, I have 55 mpg. This directly, right? I can do 8,887 grams of CO2 divided by 55, and I will get 160 grams of CO2 per mile. So there's a direct correlation between efficiency and emissions. But for an electric car, I have an efficiency of 0.29 kilowatt hours per mile. And then I have no idea what the emissions are, because it's like, depends where you are, depends when you charge, yeah, and so on, right? So how does the regulatory agency deal with this? Well, they don't. So the way it was done back then and the way that is currently still being done, and the way it is currently being debated, because we're actually up for our next round of EPA regulations coming out very soon. I cannot actually say anything. So the way it was done, so you had these incentives for alternative fuel vehicles. You have weights and multipliers. And the weights are essentially what allow you to just ignore this issue. So basically, they're saying weight factor of 0. So you multiply your emissions rate for alt fuel vehicles by your weight. And if it's 0 for electric vehicles, then basically for EPA, you just have 0 grams of CO2 per mile. So you don't really have to think about the upstream issues. Yeah. Sure.
As a federal agency considers new standards, and those standards would apply to EVs, how would they consider the different battery chemistries in terms of efficiency? So like you just have a straight up efficiency number, say, great, I don't care what, if it's sodium ion, lithium ions, or whatever else, I don't care what it is, as long as you hit this, great. But then there's other components of that battery chemistry, like capacity to charge vehicle, range, a variety of things, right? Performance elements. So like how, like hypothetically, and if you raise and as because of the nascency of battery chemistry, like lots going to be lithium ion, but there's other stuff that comes on. How would you appropriate ratchet it up or make it
Okay.
full across?
All right. So we're gonna forget about CO2. We're just gonna think about efficiency. And I think you are overthinking this, because if you care about efficiency, I don't really care about how you get there. The analogy for a gas car would be like saying, oh, if you cared about like the chemistry of the battery, that would be like saying, oh, I want efficiency based off of if you're like a V6 or a V8 or something, or
Okay,
right.
so-
Like it doesn't matter how you get there, and I don't care how you get there as long as you are at a certain level of efficiency.
Just set it and market will work.
Yeah. So in the regulation, they actually do have an emissions rate for electric vehicles. It gets multiplied by 0, so no one ever actually really has to worry about it or think about it. But it is actually based off of upstream emissions. So it thinks about an average. It thinks about an average electricity emissions rate across the whole country in a given year, taking into account like the upstream production of the fuel, and then factoring in like the difference in the upstream production of like gasoline, so that it's like on a levelized basis. So if we didn't have the weighting factor, would that be a good metric to use? What do you guys think? Huh? For EVs.
You have no weighting factor. Don?
So if this was 1, so we're treating them like actual vehicles. Okay, you're saying no, so why not?
Because that means like, because you have such a different grid mix across the United States, that like me as an automaker, if I sell a car, it's like, I don't know where that's going. It could go to the southeast where there's a ton of coal, or it could go to PNW where there's a ton of hydro. I have no control over like.
Oh, okay, wait.
emissions.
Yeah. So you're saying that it would be bad to have an emissions rate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For automakers, right? They have no control. They absolutely no control of that, right?
Yeah. So that is the argument on the automaker side, right? So their ability to affect the emissions rate and the electricity grid doesn't really exist. And if you were to do a more nuanced upstream emissions, where you would like California has its own emissions rate and Texas has its own emissions rate, then this becomes rapidly too complex to regulate, right? Yeah.
You do that, you should do that as well for the integrate. Because then you have other upstream emissions that are not being accounted for. They will break.
No, so that's what I was saying, where they subtract out the upstream of the gas from the accounting to make it sort of more equal. Yeah.
We're already tracking sales by data integration. I mean, have different multipliers for different periods based on sale location. And with automakers and changing the distribution where they're selling cars.
Well,
Yeah, but now your regulation is like now automakers might choose to sell less cars in California. It's just gonna lead to all these crazy things happening.
You say, okay, if I'm gonna do state by state, then I can take the average, like, but, well, what if someone has solar income? Right, what if they're charging the vehicle during the cleanest hours every day, so it's like, it would be. I mean, in theory, they could, like, there's data out there that allow you to do it, but it's so impossible.
Yeah. So in my opinion, so my personal opinion is that that you should untie them. So efficiency and emissions are no longer together. And then you have regulations still for efficiency, so that automakers can improve things that they actually have the ability to change in the vehicle, right? So this would, if you targeted this number, then they could still do things like different types of battery chemistries, more efficient motors, so on and so forth. And then this part of it would just be 0. And then you would leave cleaning the grid to other policies. That's how I would do it, but it's
Are
complicated.
they planning on time?
I
Oh, it
don't know.
Sounds like if I were to do it, I would be pissed.
Yeah. Okay, so current regulation doesn't really differentiate EVs, right? As we've been discussing, and that can be sort of problematic. So, right, that is the Ioniq was the most efficient. It's not actually being sold anymore, but this was the most efficient electric vehicle on the market. The Jaguar I-Pace was the least efficient. So the fuel economy regulations actually treat these two cars the same, even though from a gas car equivalent, this would be like a Prius compared to like a Mustang, right? That's how different the efficiencies are in these two cars.
The new one, I kind of.
Yeah.
I think it's like really good.
Wouldn't consumers then drive the change if the information is self-transparent as to which is consuming more electrical energy per 100 miles, let's say? Wouldn't the consumer market itself make automakers put more efficient EVs out there, or is it not enough?
There's a saying. So consumers don't know what cars they want. Automakers know what cars consumers want. So
How is that?
So prior to I had this nice little stat. So prior to the update of the fuel efficiency standards, if you look at car commercials, I was doing this thing where I was tracking car commercials during the Super Bowl, and you look at what types of things that they advertise. And prior to like 2008, it's like power, right? 0 to 60, and car size, like how much capacity that you have. And then once the fuel economy standards were updated and rolling out, you started to see more and more car commercials being like fuel efficiency, right? And so at the end of the day, there's a question of who really is kind of deciding on these things, right? Like no one, I have never seen a car commercial, an EV car commercial that's like, this EV is more efficient than this other EV, right? Like that's not a thing.
Because I was wondering if the previous ZEV standards that gave different amounts of credits based on had the unintended consequence of lowering the efficiency by shoving in its batteries.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a balance of all of these things, but the fact is that when you have regulation in place, it forces the automaker to do that, right? Instead of relying on consumers who may or may not be influenced by car commercials to allow automakers to not deal with it, right? Who knows?
The range, though, I think is like, it's not because like efficiency is bad.
Yeah, range is not necessarily tied to this. You could just put in a big battery.
Batteries heavy, they're gonna have a really effect that lower your efficiency.
Yeah. The Hummer EV doesn't care.
But the range thing, I think for people who care about that more, because like the charging infrastructure, like if you're in a gas car, you're like, oh, I can go ahead and yeah, right.
More range is,
yeah. Well, and just like people probably think about it like, oh, I'm going to sure, like as opposed to.
Yeah. Okay. So there's another interesting effect that happens. So if you think about an automaker that kind of exactly complies with the standard, which is most automakers are going to do this, and we observe this kind of empirically too, right? So what that means is for every really clean car that I sell, which lets me over comply with the standard, that lets me sell a dirty car, right? As long as they average out to that standard, then that's fine. But because of these weights and multipliers, it means the clean car that I sell, actually looks a lot cleaner than it actually is, right? So this was one of the another modeling study that that I had done. And so this is basically saying, if this is my standard, you know, if I sell a Chevy Volt as Chevy or as GM, I'm then allowed to sell a dirty car. But actually, if this is the true emissions of my car because of the weights and the multipliers, then the way it's counted is actually this, which lets me sell an even dirtier car. And so all of this extra stuff is like extra emissions that are happening because of the weights and multipliers. And so from a 55 mpg, you're not actually going to be getting that. It's going to be slightly less than that. So it decreases the stringency of the standards by like 1 to 2%, which translates to like X 100 million tons of CO2 because of having these things.
It's still a net positive.
Yeah, it's still a net positive. So instead of 55 mpg, it ended up going down to like 53 mpg. Yeah.
Is regulating models a feasible thing? You cannot make a car model that is under 15 mpg.
I mean, yeah, but I think that would be a really not good way. That there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to do something like that, right? Because then you're only regulating their worst car, and then all the other cars would not necessarily be all the other cars wouldn't have an incentive to improve.
Fewer super clean cars, more close to the line.
Yeah. I mean, you don't really care about how an individual model is efficient or emitting. You care about how everyone together is. And so if that's what you care about, you should regulate it that way. Okay, so yeah, there's a bunch of, you know, interesting sort of modeling that can be done in response to these regulations coming out, understanding unintended consequences, how they work, and helping inform future design, right? And so there were a couple sort of papers and studies that had done that. Yeah.
Could you elaborate what each parameter was in calculating that CO2 emissions?
We can talk about that after class if you want to. Yeah. Okay. So a bunch of so I'll wrap up the cafe stuff really quick to talk about some of the interesting sort of political policy stuff that happened over the last couple of years. So remember, I was saying that NHTSA is not allowed to regulate for, you know, that entire period of time from 2012 to 2025. And so they have to do these like midterm reviews to update the regulations, and similar with the EPA at certain periodic intervals, they have to update them. So that was intended to happen over the course of 2017. So remember, you have to announce your rulemaking, you have to go through your public comment period, and then you have your final rule. So 2017 is when this was supposed to happen. But end of 2016 rolls around and Trump gets elected president in fall of 2016. Huh?
No new rulemaking.
Yeah. So no new rulemaking, or at least let's say they were worried about the rulemaking happening under the Trump administration. Yeah.
For the first 5 months, we didn't make any rules, like no safety.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Just truth of politics.
Yeah, but so what ended up happening specifically with Cafe was that instead they decided okay, we announced the proposed rule in December of 2016. And then instead of a 3 to 6 month public comment period, you have a 1 week comment period. And so I remember this happening and everyone was like, what? And everyone was like scrambling and like writing comments and like, oh my God, all the automakers were freaking out. Everyone was freaking out and submitting all these comments.
I think the one out loud regulation is faster than the legislation.
Yes. And then like 3 days after the comment period closed, they're like, okay, here's the final rule. Here are our responses to comments. And every single response was, thank you for your comment. We've considered it. And then the final rule was announced with no changes. Cool. So we like slid that in last minute. Yeah, so okay, this actually doesn't, you're not actually allowed. Turns out like you can't actually do this. I'm not gonna say that I think this was like a good, well, it's not great that we would do something like this, but like actually there's a lot of like underlying political and policy strategy that's happening here behind this that allowed them to basically make it more difficult for the Trump administration to kind of change some of these things. Kind of. So any rules and regulations that get put into place post-election can actually be really easily overturned. And so that's actually what happened, is that when Trump came into office, this stuff got removed pretty quickly. But it did allow for the administration, or for this previous administration and folks in the EPA to submit these in like judicial challenges and require the new EPA to actually respond to all the stuff that happened here. So there was like this strategy behind them rushing this regulation through. Yeah.
Were those changes from the updated version?
No, it was just like they proposed the rule, and then the final rule was exactly the same as the proposed rule. So they like responded to comments, but not really.
Like, I'm remembering now, like, it was the first, right? But then didn't all the automakers say, actually, no, we want the higher standard?
Well, yeah. So there was, yeah. So basically what happened is the Trump administration put forward this new thing called the SAFE rule, Safer, Affordable, Fuel Efficient rule, which basically takes the standards and then freezes them so that they're flat again, starting in 2021. And they had some changes in the analysis to justify this. So faster turnover, reduced carbon price, and increased technology costs for the assumptions going into the modeling that let them do this. And then there were a lot of like legal challenges to this whole thing. There's a lot of modeling and research in response, right? So this was one of the big papers that came out where a bunch of economists got together and were like, the Trump SAFE rule analysis is like completely bogus for all of these reasons. They said that they like way overstated things like safety costs and that sort of thing. So there was a whole bunch of political stuff that started to happen. So what you were mentioning actually is in California, if you remember, California had that ability to do their own set of regulations. And so they were like, all right, if you're gonna mess around at the federal level, we're gonna start doing our own thing again. And then the whole thing was like gonna be this big fight, because then the Trump administration would say, well, good luck getting a waiver, because you need a waiver to do your emission standards. And then CARB was like, aha, we preempted you because we talked to car companies who opted into joining our standards voluntarily. So that's what you're referring to. So like half the automakers were like, all right, we're just gonna do whatever California says voluntarily so that there isn't any issues with the waiver thing. And then half the car companies were like, no, we're gonna do what Trump wants. So where are we now? So the safe rule was like very quickly repealed. And actually we have the new rulemaking proposal was in 2021 that passed. And so the safe rule when it did pass actually didn't freeze them. It increased efficiency requirements by 1.5% a year. And now it's back up to 8% per year. The Obama era standard was about 5% per year. Yeah, and so that's where we are with the CAFE standards, the EPA standards for emissions rates. Those are going to come out like the initial proposed rulemaking is going to come out very soon.
Like Friday, cleared out with the trash.
Yeah, I can't say the date, but soon. And it will be for anyone interested in this world, it'll be in this, area of things, it will be very interesting. We'll put it at that. Okay, so that's CAFE standards and the GHG emission standards. This has been a big part of my life for like a decade. Okay, any questions about any of this stuff? Okay, so for the last bit of class, the last thing we'll talk about is a much more sort of recent piece. So this is legislation, not regulation, but is going to make a meaningful impact in the world of energy, transportation, climate. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in August, last year, and it is probably one of the most unprecedented spending bills in the area of climate and energy. And so just to give a sense of what this kind of looks like, broadly speaking, so all of these plots come from this summary that McKinsey put together. So it's kind of a nice little summary here. So, and yeah, McKinsey is a big consulting company. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, sometimes. So these are investments broken down by sector. So energy, manufacturing, environment, transportation, agriculture, and water. And then in addition to that, it actually provides authority to the Department of Energy loan program to make really substantial loans. And so that looks something like this. So another 250 billion in energy infrastructure, 62 billion in innovative clean energy, and another 55 billion in advanced technology vehicle manufacturing. So this is like very substantial amounts of money. This is, magnitudes higher than anything that has been spent before in this area. Yeah.
The LPO
No, they're loan authority, right? They're not receiving this.
No, I didn't realize it.
Yeah. Well, the number that you're probably thinking of is the 250 here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was like 40 billion or something.
That might be like year one invest or loans.
And then there was an affordable.
Yeah. Okay, so who gets that money? So out of that 394 billion, you have federal operations, loans, grants, tax incentives for consumers and corporate that might be the number you're thinking of. Loan. So those would be loans coming out of the initial investment authority from Congress, not through the Department of Energy. Although some of those might be dispersed by the DOE.
Because what's been well, they've given a bunch of loans to like battery recyclers, battery manufacturers. I think they're giving some. Is that coming out of the 40 or?
Some of them will, yeah. They'll be coming out of both these buckets. And then if you are even, as an individual consumer or, a company in this space, right, we're talking about really significant amounts of money, right? So as an individual, you get $2,000 consumer tax credit for buying heat pumps, water heaters, biomass stoves and boilers. And then lots of different incentive. Before I get to that, so also as a consumer, you can get vehicle tax credits, right, for used and for new electric vehicle purchases. And then there are a bunch of like production tax credit type things, $3 per kilogram for clean hydrogen, which is, a fair amount of change. Nuclear support, and then support for zero carbon generation of electricity. Yes.
4,000 is the base, right? And there's adders for the amount.
No, this is the 4,000 is the used vehicle tax credit. The
35.
That's it. 35. Wait. 37. 50. Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of these, with the power generation tax credits, we need to considering like a tax equity investor, or is it direct pay option? Like you can get a direct refund on your tax filing.
I don't know.
I know how. So if you are a public agency and you are an off taker, you can do direct. So only work for public agencies. If you're private, then you have to have a tax equity investor in order to flip the credits. But you're basically like flipping the credits you're not flipping at the full cost. You're flipping them at like 30% of the value. It's a lot lower than not getting the full value. The investor has to then be in monetize. They tried to do direct pay for the others, but like they didn't want to do. It was like we didn't want to give the money over like that. They felt like this felt more possible.
Yes. Okay. Major funding themes of IRA. This is actually combined with another infrastructure law that passed in December of 2021, bipartisan infrastructure law that also gave some fairly substantial investments. And so, across batteries and renewables, clean electricity, efficiency, hydrogen, give us some sense of where that money is going as well.
What's the carbon?
Yeah, I was trying to look at that. I wasn't entirely sure. Yeah. So CDR. Yeah.
There's 3.5 billion DOE for carbon removal. I think it's like direct air capture.
Yes.
Maybe
and some CCS. Yeah. Yeah. So from a modeling perspective, right, this just came out, so lots of people are thinking about the impacts of IRA in many sort of different ways. And I think over the next few months, over the next few years, you're going to see lots of papers and research coming out about this. And so if you're interested in this area too, this is probably a good time to leverage some of these skills and methods that you guys have learned in this class to apply and think about policy issues like this. And so at a very sort of preliminary level, people have already started to look at this, right? And at sort of like broad strokes. So we can see a little bit of what, fast modeling turnaround has kind of looked like. So these are three different models that look at the emissions impact of having IRA. The repeat that is Jesse Jenkins. He's a professor at Princeton. His modeling group worked on this, looking at Inflation Reduction Act compared to a bunch of sort of other scenarios, right? And so doing scenario analysis gives you a good sense of what the benefits of this kind of policy might be compared to other things. Here they have uncertainty analysis, right? So employing some of the things that we've talked about in giving sort of these ranges of values for the expectation of current policies without Inflation Reduction Act versus with the Inflation Reduction Act, and how much carbon benefit that's getting you, right? And so, yeah. Generally speaking, their models are fairly in alignment, but as we have a little bit more time separation between when IRA came out and things are actually happening, I think a lot of these models are going to get refined and be able to look a little bit more specifically in detail on sector or technology specific impacts. Resources for the future. They have this haiku model, electricity model, that helps give a sense of what IRA will do to retail electricity prices. So you can see in sort of the blue and orange different scenarios of IRA. And then they do this across different scenarios of natural gas prices. Energy policy simulator. So that was the one on the other side for emissions earlier. They also have their model also has outputs looking at broad macroeconomic trends. So what's happening as a result of IRA in relation to changes in GDP and changes in jobs and labor. And then sort of lastly, going back to the Princeton group, was it the Zero Emissions Lab? I think Zero Lab. Yeah. So they have done a little bit more looking at things like how IRA will help achieve the emissions target from the Biden administration. So getting to 50% below 2030, 50% below 2005 emissions levels by 2030. And so given what IRA will do, they're projecting that is already going to account for 2/3 of that target. They've looked at how fossil fuel production is going to decrease in the future as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act displacing fossil fuel demand with clean energy. And then looking at, so we've actually seen that part of the graph before, right? So this is describing how new electricity capacity, like new power plants, are getting installed every year. And so there are projections in the future about how much capacity is getting installed, right? Lots of solar, lots of wind in the future as a result of IRA policy. Yeah.
Did this? They have scenarios with like different amount of transmission. There's like this.
They're doing a lot of that right now too, as well.
Assume that they don't have like low, medium, high case percentage built out. They didn't like.
They probably have some versions of that somewhere. A lot like I'm a little bit more hesitant about this stuff. It hasn't been like formally peer reviewed. But still, it's a good kind of insight at a high level to understand some of the like macro trends that will probably be happening as a result of IRA. Okay, so all of that having been said, right, there's a lot of room for contribution in, especially in the sort of policy space of modeling, right? And it doesn't have to be this thing where you are just making these models and sort of publishing papers, right? There is opportunity for this like interaction between real stakeholders and policymakers to understand, you know, outcomes from these models that, you know, really would be difficult to get at in any other way. So it's important to apply a lot of this thinking and analysis into, you know, these systems, transportation and energy sectors. Yeah, and so hopefully you guys have seen some nice examples of models that apply a lot of these principles and methods and techniques in terms of what we've learned in the class, right, to really sort of relevant relevant application of these things in policy. So economic analysis obviously is going to be really important, thinking about costs and benefits. And so that rolls in, you know, monetary analysis, discounting, and all of these other like financing things that we've talked about. And that's kind of closely related to decision making. So with risk analysis, you know, how a lot of these projections depend on behaviors of, you know, corporations and their decision making, and then technological viability, understanding a little bit about the technologies to understand how they work, what are future viable technologies in these areas to think about, and then lastly and importantly, uncertainty and sensitivity. Where does it make a lot of sense to have like good accuracy and precision? Where do we know there's going to be sources of uncertainty, and how can you convey that in your model outputs? And then importantly, you know, it's not just about like making these tornado diagrams or making these like Monte Carlo things. It's about conveying that, what that means to a relevant, you know, stakeholder, policymaker, right? They have to understand this point, and it can be difficult sometimes. Like I'm like thinking from personal experience, even like conversations I've had today. Like there's reasons why, you know, displaying uncertainty and sensitivity is really important, and sometimes it's like showing just one number can be really problematic for decision making. So yeah, this element is really important to think about. Okay, and so that's it for our full class. So hopefully you guys can take some of this and go forth in your lives and make your modeling useful for people in the future. Yes.
Or to become aware of new policies as they come and what that can be analyzed.
Yes. So, no, I mean, maybe, but not, I wouldn't really recommend Twitter. Yeah, so part of so getting engaged and involved, some of the process of understanding like the right avenues to kind of have conversation and talk to people, well, some of that is going to be through sort of experience. So like being able to identify like areas to make a contribution or areas that you think are important, that's going to be practice and experience, and the more you think about these issues, the better you'll get at that. And then as far as the exposure to these things, yeah, staying engaged in as many ways as possible, right? And so Twitter could be one of those, but there are lots of sort of different avenues. And so maybe you hear something on the news, then, you know, actually go into, if it's something of interest to you or relevant to research, don't just brush it off, like go into it a little bit more, see, you know, read about what's happening. And then probably the most important for like professional development is that when you have a chance to interact, to talk to or listen to stakeholders who are relevant in these areas, like go out and listen to them and talk to them, and that's going to broaden your network to get sort of more and more exposure, right? And so the more that you do that, I think the more opportunities there will be to increase exposure to these things. Hopefully that helps. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
No, our communication for avenues, you know, I missed that.
Yeah, I'll post it online too. This is the presentation order as randomly determined by a computer. And if it doesn't work, you can like switch with somebody, but just have to let me know. Yeah, 10 to 15 minutes. I'll post that information on Canvas. Yeah. Yeah, the rubric is on Canvas, although I like changed the amount of time, so I'll update that. Okay, great. And so that's our last lecture for this quarter. So I'll see you guys on Monday for your presentations. Yeah. Yes, at the end of the day. This homework was meant to be like kind of easy, so yes.
Do you have
Drinking the water.
a recommended way to use the sliders, because it is an absolute nightmare for some people?
That idea buffers.
Can you?
Yeah.
Oh my god,
I don't know.
I don't know how.
You can double click it in the box.
I don't want it.
Are you serious?
Yeah.